The courtroom at the Hartwell Assizes had been built to make a person feel small, and on the third morning of the hearing, it was doing its work on Eleanor with terrible efficiency. The high windows let the autumn light fall in cold bars across the public benches, and every bar of it seemed to land on her, the woman in the plain gray gown who had dared to claim a name that did not belong to her. That was the whisper that had followed her up the worn stone steps and into the gallery. That was the word the gentlemen passed behind their gloves, and the ladies folded into their fans. Fraud. She sat with her hands closed in her lap, and her chin level, and she did not let them see that the word had teeth. At the front of the room, beneath the magistrate's bench, the Duke of Ashbourne stood very still. He had not been called to speak. He had no legal interest in the matter that any clerk could name. Rye. Yet he had come on each of the 3 mornings, and had taken the same seat at the end of the front row. And twice now Eleanor had felt the weight of his attention settle on her and lift away before she could be certain of it. She told herself she imagined it. A man of his rank did not look twice at a woman the whole county had decided was a liar. She had learned in the past year exactly how little she was worth in the ledger of such men. If you have ever sat in a room where everyone has agreed upon your guilt before a single witness is sworn, then you already know the particular code of that gallery, and I would ask you only to stay with Eleanor a little longer, because the morning was not finished with any of them. What none of them knew, not the magistrate, not the gentlemen with their gloves, not the Duke at the end of the row, was that the man whose absence had condemned her was at that hour stepping down from a mud-spattered post-chaise in the inn-yard a quarter-mile away. Eleanor Vane had come to Hartwell 11 months earlier as a woman with a name and a small competence and a letter in her trunk that she believed would be honored. She had left the north after her mother's death and traveled south to the house her father had taken before he sailed, the modest brick house at the edge of the village, with the green door and the iron gate that did not quite latch. She had expected to keep that house for him until he returned. She had not expected to find another family already installed in it, nor to be told with great courtesy and no mercy that the man she called her father had never existed under the name she gave. The proximate author of her ruin was Mrs. Desper Coleridge, the widow of a wool merchant who had bought the brick house at auction the spring before Eleanor arrived, and who regarded Eleanor's appearance at her gate as a personal affront. Mrs. Brez. Coleridge was not a cruel woman in her own estimation. She was a careful one. She had paid good money for clear title, and a girl who turned up claiming to be the daughter of a man named Vane, when the deed named no Vane and the parish register held no record of any such marriage or birth, was to her mind plainly a swindler testing whether grief and a soft face might shake loose what coin had honestly secured. The whole village took its lead from Mrs. Coleridge. To the village, Eleanor was the impostor at the Green Gate. They said it in the market, and they said it in the churchyard, and they said it eventually in the language of the law, when Mrs. Coleridge brought her complaint before the magistrate and asked that the matter of the false claimant be settled once and for all. Eleanor had no money for counsel, worth the name. She had a country attorney, Mr. Sedge Pell, who was honest and overmatched, and she had her father's letter, which the court had examined and set aside as the sort of document any clever hand might forge. What the court could not examine because she would not show it was the thing that the word fraud actually struck against. Eleanor's wound was not the loss of the house. It was older than that. Her father, Captain Josiah Vane, had gone to sea when she was 9, and for 14 years he had been a man made entirely of letters, a hand on paper, a voice she could no longer quite hear in her memory. Half the village said he was dead, and the other half said he had never been her father at all, and on the worst nights she could not herself have said with certainty which version she most feared. To be told she was a fraud was, in the end, to be told that the one steady love of her childhood had been a fiction she had told herself to keep from being alone. That was the tooth in the word. That was what she would not let them see. On the first morning of the hearing, the Duke of Ashbourne had entered late, and the room had rustled and risen and resettled around him the way a field resettles after a hawk crosses it. He was perhaps 34 tall, with a kind of stillness that other men mistook for coldness, and that Eleanor, watching him sidelong, was not certain she trusted. His coat was very dark and very plain. His face was grave and closed. He had buried a wife, the gallery murmured 3 years past, and had not been seen in society since, and no one could account for why the great man had chosen this small, ugly business to break his retirement. Eleanor could not account for it either. She only knew that when the magistrate first spoke the word impostor aloud, she had felt the Duke go still in a new way, a stillness with an edge to it, and when she had glanced toward him his jaw had been set like carved stone. That had been 3 days ago. Now, on the third morning, the case against her was very nearly complete. Mrs. Biz. Coleridge had given her evidence in a clear, unhurried voice. The deed produced, the parish register produced, the absence of any Captain Vane in any record the clerk could find laid out like cards on a table. The country attorney had done what little he could. The magistrate, a tired, courteous man named Sir Henry Maundrell, had begun to gather his papers in the manner of a man who has already written the ending in his mind. It was then that the Duke of Ashbourne rose. He did not raise his voice. "Why?" he asked Sir Henry with great formality, whether the court would indulge him a question, and Sir Henry, who could refuse a duke nothing without consequences he did not wish to court, inclined his head. The Duke turned and looked at Eleanor for the first time openly, and the whole gallery turned with him. And she felt the heat climb her throat under all those eyes and hated her body for betraying her. "Miss Vane," he said. His voice was low and level and carried to every corner of the silent room. "You have been called a great many things in this place. I have sat here 3 days and heard them. I should like to ask you one thing, and I should like you to answer it as if no one in this room could hurt you for the truth. What was the name of your father's ship?" It was an absurd question. It had no bearing on the deed or the register. Mrs. Coleridge's counsel half rose to object and thought better of it. Eleanor looked at the Duke and could not read him at all, and something in the plainness of the question, the way it asked her, not for proof, but for memory, undid a knot she had been holding for 11 months. "The Perseverance," she said. "Out of Whitby. He sailed in her this spring. I turned 9, and he wrote to me from every port she touched, and the last letter came from Lisbon 2 years ago. And then there were no more." The Duke held her eyes a moment longer. Then he sat down and said nothing further, and the gallery did not know what to make of it, and neither did she. Let me tell you what I noticed, though, watching from where the story lets me watch. When she said the word Lisbon, the Duke closed his hand slowly upon the head of his cane, the way a man closes his hand upon something he has been waiting a very long time to be given. To understand why a duke would cross a county to sit 3 days on a hard bench for a woman he had never met, you must go back 6 weeks to a wet evening in the great library at Ashbourne, when a letter reached him from a port agent in Lisbon. That, though, is his story, and his stories did not open easily, and so the telling will keep to Eleanor a while, who knew none of it. She walked back to her lodging that third evening, through a thin cold rain that found the seams of her cloak, past shop windows where the candles were being lit, past faces she had come to know by their disapproval, certain that the next morning would see her named a criminal before the whole world. A grocer's wife drew her child closer as Eleanor passed. A man she had once nodded to in church turned his shoulder. She had grown used to the small daily arithmetic of being unwanted, the way a body grows used to a stone in a shoe, never quite forgetting it is there but learning to walk regardless. Her lodging was a single room above the chandler's. Taken on credit she could not in truth afford, the floor slanting toward the window and the smell of tallow rising through the boards, and the only living soul who treated her as a person rather than a verdict was the chandler's daughter, a girl of perhaps 11 named Susan, who had appointed herself Eleanor's friend. Without asking permission, Susan brought her bread and dripping wrapped in a clean cloth and a tallow end to read by, and she sat on the foot of the narrow bed with her elbows on her knees and asked the questions that no one else in Hardwell would dignify with asking. "Did you truly know a captain?" Susan said that evening, swinging her bare heels against the bed frame. Mother says you made him up to get the house. But you don't seem like someone who makes things up. I knew him, Eleanor said. She was at the small window watching the rain run down the glass in long, crooked threads, and she did not turn around because she did not want the child to see her face. He had a scar across the back of his left hand from a rope that ran out too fast when he was a boy. He could splice a line and gut a fish, and recite a great deal of Cowper very badly. He kept a tin of preserved oranges in his sea chest and gave me one each time he came home. And he smelled of tar and salt and those oranges all at once. I did not make him up, Susan. I would not have known how to invent the oranges. Susan considered this with the grave attention of the young, who understand better than their elders that the small particular details are the ones that cannot be faked. Then where is he? I do not know, Eleanor said, and the honesty of it cost her. And the rain ran on. He sailed away when I was no older than you. He wrote to me from Cadiz and from Naples and from a dozen ports I had to find on the schoolroom map, and I kept every letter in a ribbon, and then the letters stopped, and a person can keep a ribbon of letters only so long before the world begins to ask her why she bothers. She was quiet a moment. I bother because they are mine. That is the whole of my reason, and it has never once been enough for anyone but me. Susan reached over, and with the directness children are permitted and adults are not, took Eleanor's cold hand in both of her warm ones and held it. She said nothing, having no more words, but she held on, and Eleanor let her. And for a little while the slanted little room was not the worst place in the world to be. The witnessing happened the next morning before the court sat, and Eleanor did not know she was witnessed. She had gone early to the churchyard because she could not bear the lodging, and could not yet bear the gallery, and she had found the sexton's small boy crouched and weeping at the lych gate over a dead linnet he had meant to keep as a pet, the little bird gone stiff in his cupped palms. Most grown persons that morning had larger sorrows and would have told him so. Eleanor did not. She knelt in her good gray gown in the wet grass beside him, heedless of the stain it would take and the hem she could not afford to spoil. And she asked him the bird's name, and he told her it had no name yet because he had not been quick enough to give it one, and that undid the child entirely. So she helped him scrape a small grave beneath the yew with a flat stone for a spade, and she laid the linnet in it on a bed of moss, and she said a few plain words over it, as though it mattered, because, to the child, it did. Then she gave him her own handkerchief to wipe his face, the square of fine-worn linen with her mother's initials worked into the corner in faded blue thread, the last good thing she owned in the world, and she folded his fingers around it and told him to keep it. She did not tell him it was the last of her mother. She only stood and brushed the grass from her knees and squared her shoulders for the gallery, and the word that waited there. The Duke of Ashbourne had been standing inside the churchyard wall the whole while, having come, as had become his habit, to the one quiet place the town afforded a man who did not wish to be spoken to. He had watched a woman accused of caring for nothing but a house kneel in the mud for a dead bird and a weeping child, and dig a grave with a flat stone, and give away the last good thing she owned to a sexton's boy, who could never repay her and would likely forget her by Michaelmas. He had buried things he loved. He knew to the ounce what it cost to kneel down to a grief that's small and tended properly anyway. When Eleanor passed out through the gate, she did not see him, and he did not speak, and he stood a long while afterward beside the yew, with his hand resting on the cold stone of the wall, and an expression on his closed, grave face that there was no one there to read. The fourth morning of the hearing was the one that broke her, and it began with the Dowager. The Dowager Lady Marcham was Mrs. Coleridge's distant cousin and patroness, a thin, upright woman with diamonds even at a morning sitting, and she had come down to Hartwell ostensibly to support her kinswoman, and in truth the gallery understood to see the Duke of Ashbourne, whose long retirement she considered a waste of a most eligible man. She had brought with her a young woman of great polish, and a gown the color of ice, her goddaughter Miss Augusta Frayne, whom she had decided some months before would make Ashbourne an admirable second duchess. The Dowager did not like mysteries. and the mystery of why Ashbourne had buried himself for 3 days in a sordid little fraud case had a single obvious solution, and the solution was the woman in grey. "You see how it is," the Dowager said to Mrs. Coleridge, not troubling overmuch to lower her voice, as the gallery filled. "The creature has fixed upon him. They always do, these adventuresses. The moment they see there is a great name in the room. A penniless thing with a forged letter. And now she casts her eyes at a duke. It would be amusing if it were not so squalid." The word reached Eleanor exactly as it was meant to. Adventurous. It was a new tooth, and it bit cleanly. She kept her face still and felt the blood beat in her throat, and was aware, with the helpless precise awareness she had begun to dread, of exactly where in the room the Duke was standing, 3 yards to her left, though she did not look at him. Miss Frayne arranged herself at the Dowager's hand and looked at Eleanor once, the long, incurious look one gives a stain on a tablecloth, and looked away. Then the court sat, and Sir Henry took up his papers, and it became clear at once that he meant to conclude. Mrs. Coleridge's counsel summed the matter in a few dry sentences. There was no Captain Vane in any register of the parish, the county, or the relevant naval lists that had been searched. The deed to the brick house was clean. The letter the claimant relied upon was unwitnessed and unprovable. A young woman who arrives in a place with nothing but a story and a demand upon the property of an honest widow is, the counsel said, a figure the law has unfortunately seen many times before. She is precisely what she has been called, Mrs. Coleridge added, rising in her place, permitted by the magistrate's tired courtesy a final word. A fraud. I have said it from the first day she stood at my gate, and I say it now before this court. There never was a Captain Vane. She invented a dead father to soften your hearts, and when that failed, she set her cap at a duke. I ask only that the law put an end to it. That was the third voicing, in the public arena, before all of them, and it landed with the full weight the room had been building toward. Eleanor heard it, and felt the floor of her composure go soft. She thought of Susan saying, "You don't seem like someone who makes things up." She thought of the oranges. She rose because Mr. Carrot. Pell touched her sleeve, and the magistrate had asked, with weary kindness, whether the claimant wished to say anything before he gave his judgment. She did. She had not meant to, but she did. "I have no proof you will accept," Eleanor said, and her voice was not loud, but it did not shake, and that surprised her most of all. "I have a letter you have called a forgery, and a memory you cannot weigh. I cannot make you believe in a man none of you ever met. I only know that I did not invent him. A child does not invent the smell of her father's coat. Whatever you decide I am, I was his daughter, and I will be his daughter when you have all gone home to your dinners and forgotten my face." She stopped. The room was very quiet. "That is all. I am sorry to have troubled the court." It was the kind of thing that ought to have changed nothing, and in the cold machinery of the law, it changed nothing. Sir Henry looked at her with real regret, and drew breath to deliver the judgment that everyone in the room already knew, and the Dowager permitted herself a small, satisfied settling of her diamonds, and Miss Frayne examined her gloves. And the Duke of Ashbourne sat at the end of the front row, with his hand closed, white-knuckled on the head of his cane, and his eyes fixed on the great double doors at the back of the hall, as though he were listening for something. And the doors opened. They opened the way doors open in a strong wind, both leaves at once, and the autumn light came in around the figure of a man. And the man stood a moment on the threshold, while the whole gallery turned, and the rain dripped from the hem of a much-traveled greatcoat onto the flagstones. He was perhaps 53, weathered to the color of old oak, with gray at his temples, and a sailor's roll still in his stance after a fortnight on land, and across the back of his left hand, where he gripped the door, ran an old white scar from a rope that had once run out too fast. Eleanor did not move. She could not. She had imagined this moment so many times across so many years that the reality of it arrived like a blow, and for one terrible instant she was certain she had finally, as they all said, invented him, and that she would speak his name and the figure would dissolve. "I beg the court's pardon for the interruption," the man said, and his voice filled the hall the way a sail fills. "But I am given to understand there is a question before you as to whether one Captain Vane ever drew breath. I am he. And the young woman you have spent 4 days calling a liar is my daughter Eleanor, and I will thank you to mind how you speak of her." What followed was not a thing the gallery would ever entirely sort into order, because too much happened in too short a space. Eleanor was on her feet, though she did not remember rising. Mrs. Coleridge had gone the color of paper. The country attorney was scrabbling among his documents as though the right one might suddenly grow there. And the Duke of Ashbourne had risen too, and the look on his face was the strangest of all because it was not surprise. It was the look of a man watching a thing he has arranged with great care and at great cost finally come to pass. Captain Vane came down the center of the hall, and the crowd parted for him as crowds part for the unanswerable, and he stopped before the bench and laid upon it a leather wallet swollen with papers. And he began in the plain, unhurried manner of a man accustomed to making his report, to dismantle 4 days of certainty. "I sailed in the Perseverance out of Whitby in the spring of the year. My girl turned 9, he said. Here is my certificate of service. I was took by a Barbary corsair off the Portuguese coast 2 years past, which is why my letters stopped at Lisbon, and I've spent the better part of those 2 years in a prison at Sal, which is why no register in your county has heard from me. Here is the parole signed by the Bey's secretary. Here is the affidavit of the British consul at Tangier, who saw to my passage home. As to the matter of the register, you have been searching for a Vane, and you will not find one, for I was born John Hartley of this very parish, and took the name Vane at sea, as half the fleet takes another name, and married my Mary under it, and christened my girl under it, all of which is set down here in the consul's hand and witnessed besides. Hartley is the name on your green door, sir. I bought that house 40 years ago. I am the Hartley your deed is so anxious to protect." The silence in the courtroom was the deepest Eleanor had ever stood inside. She understood dimly that the absence which had condemned her had just been filled, that the missing man was missing no longer, that the letter was not a forgery, and the father was not a fiction, and the oranges had been real all along. The understanding could not yet reach her body, though, which stood rooted, staring at the weathered face she had not seen in 14 years, and would have known among 10,000 it was Mrs. Coleridge who spoke first, and to her lasting credit, it was not to defend herself. She looked from the papers to the man to the girl in gray, and something in her careful merchant's soul recognized the unmistakable architecture of the truth. "The deed," she said faintly. "It does name Hartley. I never thought—" The agent said the family was gone. She turned to Eleanor, and her face was the face of a woman discovering she has been the instrument of a wrong she meant for a right. "I bought it in good faith, Miss Vane. But I did call you a liar, before all these people, and you were not. Now I will ask you to slow with me, because what came next is the heart of the matter, and it deserves to be told slowly." Sir Henry examined the papers for the better part of an hour, the consul's seal and the certificate of service and the affidavit, and asked his questions, and Captain Vane answered them, and the answers held. And as the truth settled over the gallery like snow settling, the people who had whispered fraud began, one by one, to remember that they had whispered it, and the room grew warm with the particular shamed warmth of a crowd that has been confidently wrong. The structural ruin was not yet undone, though, and this is where it might have ended badly even so. For the house had been honestly bought, and a deed once granted is not lightly unmade, and the captain, after 2 years in a Barbary prison, had returned with his life and his daughter's name restored, but with almost nothing else, no coin to buy back what had been sold, no standing to compel it. Sir Henry, a just man, said as much with real sorrow. The name was cleared. The fraud charge would be struck from every record, and he would see it announced through the county that Eleanor was the true-born daughter of John Hartley and no impostor. The house, however, was Mrs. Coleridge's in-law, and the captain and his daughter were, for all their restored honor, 2 persons of no fortune standing in a strange town in the rain. It was into that silence, the bitter, narrow silence between vindication and ruin, that the Duke of Ashbourne walked the length of the courtroom. He crossed it in a dozen unhurried strides, past the dowager who had half risen with Miss Frane's name already shaping on her lips, past Mrs. Brigg, Coleridge, past the bench, and he stopped before the captain, and he did a thing that emptied the breath from the entire room. He bowed. A duke to a sea captain born John Hartley. In a public court, bowed from the neck as one gentleman acknowledges a debt to another. Captain Vane, he said. 6 weeks ago, a letter reached me from a port agent in Lisbon, forwarded from my late wife's brother who served at Tangier, and who wrote to me of an Englishman lately ransomed there, a Captain Vane, who spoke without ceasing of a daughter he feared the world would have buried while his back was turned. The Duke's voice did not rise, but it had gone somewhere. It had not been before. Somewhere with the grave plainness of a man telling a truth. He has carried alone. My wife died believing I had let the world bury her quietly, while my back was turned upon my own grief. I could not save her. When your letter reached me and I learned there was a daughter in this county being called a liar over her absent father, I found I could not sit at Ashbourne and let it happen a second time. I arranged your passage from Tangier. I have sat in this room 4 days, to be certain you arrived. Before the judgment fell. You are not a moment too late, sir. I made certain you would not be. So that was the wound named once and never again. The wife he believed he had failed by being too late and too closed and too proud to reach her in her grief, and the gallery heard it and understood at last why the great man had broken his retirement for a stranger's quarrel. Eleanor heard it too, and her hand had risen without her leave to press against her own breastbone, and the Duke turned from her father to her at last. "Miss Vane," he said. The room held its breath. "There is the matter of the house, which the law cannot easily mend, and I find I am in a position to mend it, and I would not have you take it as charity, for it is not. I have watched you 4 days. A payout. I watched you in the churchyard yesterday morning when you did not know yourself watched, kneel in the wet grass for a dead bird and a weeping child, and give away the last good thing you owned. A woman who does that when no one is looking is the only kind of woman whose regard I should ever wish to earn." Lady Marcham rose fully now, her diamonds flashing, her voice sharp with the alarm of a campaign collapsing. "Your Grace, you cannot mean to attach yourself before a public court to a woman who an hour ago stood accused. Consider your name. Consider Miss Frane, who has every claim of family and fortune and propriety upon your. Miss Frane has many admirers, and will not want for one more worthy than I." The Duke said not unkindly, and he did not look away from Eleanor. And into the silence that the description had built, he delivered the line that ended the hierarchy's hold over her in the room where it had been forged. "I mean to marry Captain Vane's daughter," he said at once. He did not say it twice. The words went out across the gallery, and there was a single instant of absolute stillness, and then the room broke into the low roar of a crowd, watching its own verdict reversed. And through the roar, Eleanor stood at the center of the suddenly attentive hall with her father's scarred hand finding her shoulder from one side, and the Duke of Ashbourne standing before her with the light from the high windows falling, at last full upon his face, which was not cold at all, which had perhaps never been cold, only carefully shut against a grief he had not known how to carry until now. The dowager sat down rather suddenly. Miss Frane, to her own quiet credit, looked at Eleanor with something that was almost relief, the relief of a woman released from a destiny chosen for her by another's hand, and inclined her head a very small degree. "Mrs. Pear." Coleridge was weeping without disguise, and Sir Henry Mondrell, gathering the papers that now told an entirely different story, said, in his tired, courteous voice, that the court found the claimant to be Eleanor Vane, daughter of John Hartley, known as Captain Josiah Vane, of unimpeachable honor, and that he had not, in 30 years on the bench, been gladder to be proven wrong. The matter of the house resolved itself in the days that followed with a quiet justice that suited everyone. The Duke purchased the brick house from Mrs. Coleridge at a fair price and a little over, so that she lost nothing by her honest error and could hold her head up in the village she had so nearly led astray, and he settled the house upon Eleanor outright, in her own name before ever a word of marriage settlement was drawn, so that whatever she chose afterward, she would not be a woman without a door of her own. Mrs. Dean, Coleridge, freed of a guilt she had not known how to bear, became in time one of Eleanor's staunchest friends, and was heard more than once in the market to say that she had been a fool, and that the new Duchess of Ashbourne was worth 10 of the women who had whispered behind their fans. All of that came later, though, and the story does not end in a courtroom or a deed office, because such places are not where a person comes home. It ends, the following spring, in the brick house with the green door at the edge of the village, on an evening when the last light was going gold across the fields and a fire had been lit against the chill that lingered in English Aprils. Captain Vane sat in the good chair by the hearth with his stockinged feet stretched toward the flames, and a great deal of Cowper open on his knee, reciting it badly to no one, exactly as Eleanor had remembered him doing 14 years before, and the sound of it filled the small, warm room like the sea filling a shell. The iron gate outside had been mended at last and latched properly, and a linnet that had taken to nesting under the eaves sang the day down from the hawthorn by the wall. Eleanor stood at the window with her husband beside her, and on the sill before them lay the letter. Her father's last letter from Lisbon, the one the court had called a forgery, smoothed flat now and kept where the evening light could reach it. She had carried it for 2 years, believing it might be the last proof she would ever have that she had been loved. She did not need it as proof any longer. She kept it on the sill regardless, because some things are kept not for what they prove but for what they remember, and because the man who had written it was 12 feet away, mangling Cowper by the fire, and she could hear every word. The Duke of Ashbourne, who in this house was only ever Eleanor's husband, and the man Captain Vane had taken to calling the boy though he was 34, put his hand over hers on the sill where the letter lay. Outside the linnet sang and the gate held, and the light went gold and then gray and then soft, and somewhere behind them by the fire a sea captain who had crossed the world to keep from being too late laughed at his own bad poetry. Eleanor looked at the letter and at the mended gate and at the firelight on the wall, and she found she had nothing left to prove to anyone. She was home. Thank you for staying with Eleanor all the way to the green door. If her father walking into that courtroom moved you the way it moved me to tell it, I hope you will linger a moment in the warmth before you go and carry a little of it with you.